Welcome to an Apex Sunday podcast feature presentation where myself, Robert Ross, and John Dowsett take a look back at the 2021 season, look ahead to the 2022 season, and a shout out to our favorite auto racing related YouTube channels. The new cars for the 2022 season have launched and have conducted initial tests. It's the beginning of the second part of the hybrid era, which began in 2014, and of course has been dominated by Mercedes. They've won 8 Constructors' Championships and 7 Drivers' titles, 6 for Lewis Hamilton, 1 for Nico Rosberg. Before we talk about the new cars for 2022 and what that may mean for the upcoming season, let's take a look back at 2021. We'll start looking at the qualifying record of each team and of the championship contenders, Lewis and Max, head-to-head. We'll start from the bottom up in terms of the 2021 Constructors' Championships, which means we'll be starting with Haas. In the Haas team, Schumacher had the better season, with 2 20th places to Mazepin's 6. Schumacher's best was qualifying 14th 3 times in Russia, Turkey, and Mexico. Mazepin's best was qualifying 15th twice at Russia and Mexico. Schumacher averaged 1 position over Mazepin, 17.5 to 18.6. Not much to say other than Mick did a better job, but how good he was is difficult to say. If he follows this pattern in lower formula, we should see a big improvement, but that may be difficult to understand if the Haas is, once again, terrible, which I expect it to be. The Sauber team, branded as Alfa Romeo, fielded 2 drivers that won't be with them for 2022. Antonio got the upper hand in qualifying over Kimi, his best result being a 7th for the Dutch Grand Prix, while Kimi's best was 10th in Mexico. Both share a worse result of 20th, Azerbaijan for Antonio and Belgium for Kimi, which is usually a circuit he excels on, but the rain made for a mixed-up qualifying. With 3 10th places in qualifying, Antonio's average is a place better than Kimi's, with 13.6 compared to Kimi's average place of 15th. Of course, Kimi was out for the Dutch and Italian races due to COVID. Kubica substituted for him, qualifying 18th for the Dutch Grand Prix and 17th for the Italian Grand Prix. Shame to see Kimi go. Difficult to say what potential Antonio had. He's gone to Formula E, but does have a Ferrari testing row, probably mostly in the simulator. Williams turned out to be toward the back of the midfield this season, which is a small improvement. Russell outqualified Latifi, but not every race, which is a change. Russell's average place is 13th and Latifi's 16.2. Russell has him beat on average of 3 places. Russell's bust came in the rain-soaked Belgium qualifying, where he qualified in 2nd and of course went on to secure the 2nd in the non-race. But overall, only 4 times cracking the top 10 or better. His worst in the States with 20th place. Still, given the car, he did pretty well. Latifi's best and only time in the top 10 was again the rain-soaked Belgium qualifying. His worst was a couple of 19th places in Spain and the Netherlands. He did improve this season, but if the car is better next season, he'll have to show results. Russell, of course, will be moving on to Mercedes, which is a team within which you cannot hide. I expect him to do well. Latifi will team up with ex-Red Bull driver Alex Albon. At Aston Martin, 4-time world champion Vettel outqualified Stroll on average 11.8 to 13.2, about 2 starting grid spots. Vettel has 9 spots in the top 10 with a best of 5th at the rain-soaked Belgium Grand Prix. Lance was in the top 10 6 times with a best of 7th at Russia. Gasly was outstanding in qualifying, with 18 spots in the top 10. A best of 2nd at Qatar and averaging 6.5 for a starting position, with a worst of 12th at Spain and Abu Dhabi. Either AlphaTauri needs to make a much better car, or Gasly needs to be signed by a top team. Tsunoda, as a rookie, was up and down, showing a lot of speed but lacking consistency. 6 times in the top 10 to Gasly's 18, averaging 13 for the season, which is 7 places down on Gasly. His best being 7th at Azerbaijan and Austria. At Alpine, we had a very evenly matched lineup in terms of qualifying, with Alonso just averaging 0.3 positions better than Ocon, with 10.5 to Ocon's 10.8. Alonso was in the top 10 8 times with a best of 3rd at Qatar. His worst was 19th in the States. Ocon was in the top 10 more than Alonso, getting there 12 times. His best was 5th at Spain and worst 19th at Mexico. At McLaren, we had a bit of surprise, with Lando being an outstanding qualifier and Ricciardo having some difficulty adapting to the new car. Lando was in the top 10 19 times, with his best being a pole in Russia, averaging 7th place to Daniel's 9.6. Lando's worst was 18th at Mexico. Daniel was in the top 10 just 13 times compared to Lando's 19. His best was 4th at, again, the rain-soaked Belgian Grand Prix. His worst being 20th at Turkey. What we do see is an improvement for Daniel in the latter part of the season. At Ferrari, Leclerc qualified slightly better than Sainz, being in the top 10 19 times to Sainz's 16 times. Leclerc averaged a starting position of 6.5, which is the same as Gasly in a B team, his best being 2 consecutive poles at Monaco and Azerbaijan, his worst being 19th in Russia. Sainz averaged a starting position of 8th, with his best at Russia in 2nd and worst at Turkey in 19th. With Red Bull, we get to one of 2 drivers who are far above the rest of the field. Verstappen was only out of the top 3 twice, his worst being Russia due to penalties, and second worst still in the top 10, a 7th in Qatar, again due to a penalty. 19 times in the top 10, 20 times in the top 3, 13 times in the top 2, and of course a season-leading 10 times on pole, getting 41% of all pole positions for the season. He had an average starting position of 2.91. Sergio's first year in Red Bull was somewhat inconsistent, but as we saw in some races, he did play a significant role. 16 times in the top 10 with the best of 2nd at San Marino, and a worst of 20th in England and the Netherlands for an average of 7.05, making him 3 to 4 spots down the grid from Verstappen. Verstappen's places in the sprint saw him pick up 3 points in England, 1 point in Italy, and 3 points in Brazil, or a total of 7 points for sprint qualifying, rather significant in the championship battle. The story at Mercedes, at least in terms of average qualifying spot, looks like an even battle between Hamilton and Bottas, with both averaging a starting spot of 3.45. Lewis finished in the top 10 20 times, with his best being 5 poles, half of Verstappen's, at San Marino, Spain, Hungary, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia. His worst was 20th at Brazil due to a penalty. He scored 2 points in England and Italy for the sprints, no points in Brazil. Any loss of points in a championship battle can be very costly. Valtteri was also in the top 10 20 times, his best being 4 poles, 1 less than Lewis, at Portugal, Italy, Turkey, and Mexico, his worst being 16th at Russia, where he usually goes very well. Valtteri's performance was key to Mercedes winning the Constructors' title. He also scored a point in the British Grand Prix sprint, 3 points in the Italian Grand Prix sprint, and 2 points in the Brazilian Grand Prix sprint. Looking at the championship contenders, Max and Lewis head-to-head, we can see we have the 2 drivers that were far above the rest of the field. Lewis a slightly lower average and outside of the top 3 5 times, in contrast to Max only being out of the top 3 twice. Max with double the amount of pole positions, 10 to 5, or 41% of all poles, compared to 23% for Lewis. Rare to see 2 drivers on competing teams qualifying so well and so close to each other. I've been watching Formula One for about 30 years, and in that time, qualifying has often been more exciting than the races, usually due to the large gap between the top teams, the midfield, and the slowest cars. If you think the gaps are large now, years ago they were even larger. When I first started watching, we often had the top 2 or 3 cars lapping the entire field. So with qualifying, we get a race to pole in a compressed time period. And during my 30 years of watching F1, the qualifying format has undergone a fair amount of changes. We had qualifying in 2 sessions across 2 days. We had qualifying tires, qualifying setups that differed from race setups. We had single car, single lap qualifying. We had qualifying with starting fuel. And of course, the current 3-part elimination format. Now, qualifying, of course, sets the starting position of each driver on the grid. In the first part of the hybrid era, we've had cars that are very difficult to follow, as well as cars that are incredibly reliable, compared to the past at least. We've also got a grid of drivers that are, for the most part, at a pretty high standard or level, even with the massive reduction in testing time. So for me, qualifying is more important than ever before because you can't bank on cars dropping out or drivers spinning off, though that does, of course, happen. Because of the dirty air and aerodynamic rules of the first part of the hybrid era, the risk of being stuck behind a slower car, even if your car is much faster, is quite significant. Because of this, in addition to getting a good starting position, you absolutely have to make a good start. Qualifying in the start can be large factors in determining your race results. Fortunately, this season we saw some good racing, most particularly in the mid-pack, which meant qualifying wasn't usually the highlight of the weekend. The following things stood out to me. Bottas suffered from bad starts despite his qualifying record on average equaling Hamilton's. Most of the time when Valtteri fell back, he found it very difficult to make his way through the field, whereas Lewis and Max, they were usually able to fight through the field if they fell back. We saw Lewis Hamilton get his 100th career pole position at the Spanish Grand Prix. He went on to get 103 poles thus far. This is a remarkable record, which does speak to the reliability and safety of modern F1 cars, which has allowed drivers to have very long careers. Now, some say it's because he's been in a very good, if not the best car his entire career, even pre-F1. That is a factor, of course, but Lewis has delivered those results and maximized his ability and opportunities with the equipment he's had, which is why he's a champion and why the best drivers often find their way into the best teams. A driver is more than just talent, and Lewis has displayed strong teamwork and made excellent decisions throughout his career. Now, behind Lewis, we have Schumacher with 68 poles and Senna with 65. They too often had great cars, and of course, Senna could have had more if the cars were more reliable in his day, and Michael could have had more if qualifying with starting fuel wasn't a thing through part of his career. But regardless, they all delivered, and Lewis is no different. George Russell's qualifying form continued to be superb. I'm looking forward to what he can do in a Mercedes if they produce a competitive car for 2022, which is likely. I was surprised by Charles Leclerc's 2 pole positions given the state of Ferrari the previous season. Ferrari did not win a race, but Leclerc, gambling on his car not being fatally damaged at Monaco, was a risk worth taking, as it may have been their only opportunity for Ferrari to win in 2021. We had what were called sprint races, but they were really just another form of qualifying with some points awarded to the top 3. In effect, we had a session on Friday to determine the starting grid for the qualifying session on Saturday, which was like a race without pit stops and less laps. Overall, I didn't find them exciting, interesting, or necessary. I also find them a bit confusing because we had a pole sitter on Friday, who in terms of stats was not a pole sitter. The sprints themselves weren't particularly exciting. Maybe Brazil was a bit of an exception. Perhaps under the new rules, they will be more exciting. But again, due to some budget conflicts amongst the teams, we're only getting 3 sprints again in 2022, rather than the planned 6, with some changes to who is credited with pole positions, and there's more points for more drivers. We'll see how that goes. Max has always been very fast from the moment he got into F1, and finally having a car that can compete for the championship, he got 10 poles. Just like Lewis has consistently delivered results when he had the car to do so, so has Max. Only out of the top 3 in qualifying twice in 22 races. Outstanding qualifying record for the season, and a top qualifier of the season. No wonder he contested and won the World Championship.
Qualifying this year was amazing. It was a battle up and down the field. The highlight for me was probably the mid-pack where you had no idea who was going to be 5th to 20th, well, 50th to 19th. You knew that Mazepin was going to be last every time. He was a little bit of a fiasco. Mick Schumacher had some big games, as did the Canadian boys, Latifi and Stroll. Max and Lewis, the cream of the crop. Interestingly, 2 very different approaches where Max was going all out like a young buck with the threat of not finishing a lap and not doing well. But yeah, if you don't do well in qualifying, you don't win the races, you don't get the results. So qualifying is every bit as important as the race in my mind. Loved it.
Outside of the sprint races / qualifying, points are only awarded during the races. Before John and I share our thoughts on the racing overall in 2021, we'll take a look at the constructors and drivers points battle, as well as an overview of how each team did, comparing teammates and the 2 championship contenders head to head. We'll start with the overall Constructors and Drivers Championship and a couple of bar chart races, and then move on to a team-by-team summary, starting from the bottom up in order of the 2021 Constructors Championship, which again means we'll be starting with Haas. After that, we'll look at how John and I rated the drivers and the season itself. Battle between Mercedes and Red Bull saw some back and forth from early in the season to just after the midpoint. After that, Mercedes remained largely in front, with Red Bull battling to a very close conclusion. Below the top two teams, we saw a season-long battle between McLaren and Ferrari. It was very close throughout most of the season, with Ferrari getting the upper hand in third place during the latter part of the season. Good battles between Alpine, AlphaTauri, and Aston Martin, though Aston Martin fell behind from the mid-season onward. Williams did much better than expected, though relative to the teams above them, it doesn't look that great. Compared to previous seasons, it was. As expected, Alfa Romeo didn't score many points, and Haas absolutely none. To no one's surprise, we saw a back-and-forth battle between Lewis and Max. Early in the season, Lando was a big surprise, often being third in the championship when Valtteri and Sergio should have been in the 3 and 4 spots. Eventually, as the season progressed, Valtteri and Perez did overtake Lando. There was a great back-and-forth battle between the Ferrari drivers, Leclerc and Sainz, with Sainz eventually overtaking Lando and Leclerc. Max jumped out to quite a lead, and then Lewis mounted a great comeback. Gasly, Alonso, and Ocon did well considering the cars they had. Neither Haas driver scored a point, which is not a surprise, but Haas in previous seasons have scored points. Schumacher's best was 12th at Hungary, Mazepin's best was 14th at Azerbaijan. Schumacher had half the DNFs of Mazepin, 3-6. Schumacher's worst finishing results were 19th at France and Turkey. Mazepin's worst results were 20th at France and Turkey. Schumacher averaged a finishing position of 16.4 to Mazepin's 17.8. Antonio had the upper hand in qualifying. Kimi had the upper hand in the races. Kimi scored 10 points in total to Antonio's 3. Kimi managed to hit the top 10 4 times with the best result of 8th in Russia and Mexico. His worst finishing result was 19th at the Belgium non-race. He had only 2 DNFs. His average finishing position was 12.5. Antonio hit the top 10 only twice, his best at 9th at Saudi Arabia and his second point scoring position at 10th at Monaco. His worst was 16th at Russia. He had only 1 DNF. His average finishing position was 13.5, 1 spot down from Kimi. Russell had the superior race pace throughout the season, finishing the points 4 times to Latifi's 2. His best result was 2nd at the Belgium non-race. His worst finishing position was 17th at Azerbaijan, the Dutch Grand Prix, and Qatar. He had 4 DNFs. His average finishing position was 12.8. He scored 16 points to Latifi's 7. Latifi finished in the top 10 twice at Hungary, where he scored his best result of 7th, and a 9th at the Belgium non-race. His worst was 19th at Russia. He had 3 DNFs, his most famous, of course, being the DNF toward the end of the Abu Dhabi race. At Aston Martin, we see some parity between Vettel and Stroll. Vettel finished in the points 7 times. His best result was at Azerbaijan with 2nd. His worst was 18th at Turkey. He had 3 DNFs, the same as Stroll. His average finishing position, 10.4, to Stroll's 10.6. Stroll had 9 top 10 finishes. His best was 7th at Italy. His worst was 18th at the Belgium non-race. In the races, Gasly continued his outstanding form, finishing the points 15 times and scoring a 100 points to Tsunoda's 32. Gasly's best result was 3rd at Azerbaijan. His worst was 17th at Bahrain. He had 3 DNFs. His average finishing position was 7.7, again outstanding. Tsunoda as a rookie lacked consistency and experience. He finished in the points 7 times, his best being 4th at Abu Dhabi, his worst being 17th at Russia. He had 4 DNFs. His average finishing position was 11.6. A very evenly matched lineup in terms of qualifying and an evenly matched lineup in terms of races, with Alonso just averaging 0.1 position better than Ocon, with an average finishing position of 9 to Ocon's 9.1. Alonso was in the top 10 15 times, with the best of 3rd at Qatar. His worst was 17th at his home race, Spain. He had 2 DNFs. He scored 81 points. Ocon was in the top 10 14 times, 1 less than Alonso. His best was his victory at Hungary, in which Alonso was a big help, and Ocon returned the favor to Alonso at Qatar. His worst, 14th at Russia. He had 3 DNFs. He scored 74 points. What stands out immediately is the consistency of Lando versus the inconsistency of Daniel. Daniel's chart has very high peaks and valleys, whereas Lando's has much smaller peaks and valleys. Lando was in the points 20 times, Daniel was in the points 12 times. Lando's best was second in Italy. He may have got a victory in Russia, but for the change in the weather in the last laps. Daniel did get a victory, his best at Italy. Lando's worst was 14th at the Belgium non-race. He has only 1 DNF, he scored 160 points. Daniel's worst was 14th at the Styrian round of the 2 Austrian races. He also had only 1 DNF, he scored 115 points. The Ferrari drivers were almost as evenly matched as those at Alpine. Leclerc had the upper hand in qualifying, Carlos in the races. Carlos finished in the points 20 times. Leclerc was close, finishing 18 times in the points. Carlos's best was second at Monaco. His worst was 11th at Portugal and France. He had 0 DNFs. He scored 164.5 points. Leclerc's best was second in England. His worst was 16th in France. He had 2 DNFs. He scored 159 points. The story at Red Bull once again continues to be one of an outstanding top driver against a good top driver. Verstappen was only out of the top 2 4 times, and that's including 2 DNFs. He finished top 2 in 18 of the 22 races, which is outstanding. His best results were wins in San Marino, Monaco, France, Styria, Austria, the Belgium non-race, the Netherlands, the States, Mexico, Brazil, and controversially at Abu Dhabi. His worst finishing position was 18th at Azerbaijan. Though he crashed out, he was still classified. His average finishing position was 2.8 in contrast to Perez's 6.8. He had 2 DNFs and finished with a championship leading 395.5 points. Perez was in the points 16 times. His best result was his victory at Azerbaijan. His worst result was 20th at the Belgian non-race. He had 2 DNFs. He scored 190 points. Not enough to put Red Bull over Mercedes in the Constructors' Championship. In terms of race results, Lewis and Valtteri weren't as close as they were in qualifying. Lewis was in the points 18 times from 22 races and in the top 2 16 times. His worst result was 16th at Azerbaijan. He had 1 DNF. He averaged a racing finishing position of 2.95 and scored 387.5 points, coming in second in the championship. Valtteri finished in the points 15 times. His best, his victory in Turkey. His worst, 15th at Mexico. He had 4 DNFs. His average finishing position was 4.8. He scored 226 points, helping Mercedes win their 7th consecutive championship. The 2 championship contenders were remarkably close, making this a classic season. Max has an average finishing position of 2.8 compared to Lewis's 2.95. Max with 10 wins to Lewis's 8. Max was in the top 2 in 18 of the 22 races. Lewis was in the top 2 in 16 of the 22 races. Max had 2 DNFs. Lewis won. Max's worst result was 18th at Azerbaijan. Lewis's worst result was 16th, also at Azerbaijan. Let's start with Haas and Alfa Romeo. And to quote a former Haas F1 driver, Kevin Magnussen, he has reportedly said this about Haas in 2021. A Russian with a billionaire dad and his chemical business as backing, and Michael Schumacher's talented son, Mick. That pretty much sums up Haas's 2021 season, with the added fact that they didn't bother working on their car whatsoever throughout the season, so they could concentrate on the new car for 2022. And the other fact is that this time, Haas are actually designing the car in-house rather than having Dallara design and build it, though Dallara is still building it for Haas. Now, with such a terrible car, it's hard to distinguish yourself, but certainly Mick stood out in contrast to Nikita. And I don't really understand why Haas, the F1 team, is still in the sport. They've been on a steady decline that looks to be increasing in speed far more than the speed of their actual cars. I feel much the same about Alfa Romeo. Giovinazzi improved in 2021, but in that team it was difficult to get a full understanding of his level and development. It was Kimi's last season in F1, and it was a bit like Valentino Rossi's in MotoGP. Great careers that didn't end with great results, though overall it's not particularly relevant. I was also confused when Sauber, which this team remains, though branded as Alfa Romeo, decided not to use a factory supply of engines from Honda and became a Ferrari customer team. Perhaps the deal with Honda was a paid one and Ferrari looked much better at the time, but whatever the case, they are not matching what Sauber used to do, which included podiums and scoring a fair amount of points. I really don't expect much better from them going forward, but we'll see how that goes. The team I expected more from was the factory Renault team, now called Alpine. I was surprised by Ocon getting a victory in Hungary and Fernando getting third place in Qatar. But, teamwork was the key to getting those results. Now, Fernando was spectacular in his return. It's very difficult to return to F1, as we saw with Michael Schumacher, who only had one podium on his return, which compared to his previous record is pretty incredible. And also, I think that Fernando and Lewis have the best racecraft in Formula One. So Esteban doing so well against Fernando, I think speaks very well for his future in the sport. He could be a future world championship and definitely a top driver. Surprises of the season. For me, Carlos Sainz adapting to the Ferrari and being on the same level as Charles Leclerc in his first season was quite remarkable. On the other side, we had Daniel finding it very difficult to adapt to the McLaren. Though McLaren have stated that the issues he had did highlight issues with the car itself that they have worked on for 2022. Now, Lando had a breakout season. He was simply outstanding and contested for third in the championship early on, when basically that should have been either Perez or Bottas. It ultimately did go to Bottas, of course. Now, Ferrari and McLaren's battle was also a surprise, particularly on the Ferrari side. Like Alpine, Ferrari should be much closer to the very top, but third in the Constructors' Championship, it's a good recovery from last season. Gasly's record wasn't necessarily a surprise, but he really stood out in the AlphaTauri. They may be Red Bull's sister team, but they still have to design their own chassis and still use the Honda engine, of course. It's a good one, no doubt, and Gasly maximized what he had to work with. Now, his teammate Tsunoda was inconsistent, but he was a rookie, and I think a season's experience will see his obvious speed lead to better results. Just as Lewis got to a century and more of pole positions, he also got to a century and more of wins in his career. Again, a remarkable achievement. Finally, Red Bull produced a car that could fight for both the Constructors' and Drivers' Championship, which they've failed to do basically since Vettel's time. For once, it wasn't a battle between the Mercedes teammates, as it has been throughout this area, as we saw particularly with Nico and Lewis, but this time with Max and Lewis in different teams. It did end in a mess, unfortunately, which leads us into what I found disappointing about this season. In spite of all the great racing and the close championship battle, Formula One was also an international clown show in 2021. The officiating was terribly inconsistent and confusing. I'll highlight 3 races in particular where I found it so. First, the penalties given out at Austria for drivers on the inside line keeping their lines and not slowing down to let a driver taking a risky passing attempt on the outside made no sense to me. When you try to pass on the outside of a corner where the momentum will take the inside driver to the outside, that's always a risk. You have to be significantly alongside the inside driver to make it work, not just having your front wheel beside the inside driver's rear wheel. That space you're attempting to make the pass in is always going to close unless you get alongside the car so much that it cannot be closed. Take Villeneuve at Estoril over Schumacher. So for that, I thought the penalties were nonsense. And leading into that, we had Brazil, where Lewis made an attempt on the outside of Max, and Max did more than take his line. He went entirely off the course, pushing Lewis off course as well. Now, in Austria, the inside drivers did not go off the course. The result of Max's action in Brazil? Nothing. And George Russell said afterwards he was confused about why he was penalized at Austria, and no wonder. So the lack of ruling on this incident only empowered the poor racecraft which Max Verstappen, together with Red Bull's management, excels at. Third, of course, is Abu Dhabi. What a complete mess. Very confusing. We had Lewis get no penalty for cutting the corner against Max at the beginning of the race. And of course, there was the messed up safety car issue where some drivers were allowed to pass and others not, and so forth. It was such a mess, I really don't want to get into it, other than to say if they brought back aggregate timing, the feeling of injustice in races like this might be reduced. You see, with aggregate timing, you don't lose your margin to the other drivers around you. Look at Mansell and Alesi at Suzuka in 1994. The race was red flagged as a result of dangerous aquaplaning. When it was red flagged, Alesi was in third place and had about a 5-second margin on Mansell. On the restart on track, Mansell was right behind Alesi and even let him pass on the final lap. Now, Mansell attempted to go to the podium for a third place, but then Alesi reminded him that this is F1, not kart, where Mansell had just returned from, and that Nigel needed not only to pass Alesi on the track, but also had to be at least 5 seconds ahead of him to take that third place. Now, it was eliminated supposedly because it was too confusing, but I find the inconsistent judgments of racing incidents now far more confusing. And after years of hearing basement conspiracy theorists go on about the FIA is controlled by Ferrari, by Mercedes, by Williams, by any team that was winning at the time, I find it kind of sad that the FIA's incompetence in this regard in 2021 may have turned many people away from the sport. If it doesn't improve, it may turn more people away.
The season, my overall thoughts on the season, phenomenal. I have to disagree with you, Rob. I think that the sprint races were a wonderful ad. I'd like to see a lot more of them. You take out that factor of pit stops and planning and you put it right in the driver's hands. They can go all out and they can lose it all in a heartbeat, or they can really make a statement. Other than that, unbelievable season. It's going to go down in history. People are going to be talking about this for years. The tightness of just not the tightness of the mid pack, but on top of that, the end result, and of course the horrific officiating. If they can get back to real rules, then it'll be a really good thing. The championship, as far as I'm concerned, it was Lewis's championship. But that's racing. That's how it works. Max has got it. He won it by a complete joke in my mind. But on we go. It was a fantastic season. If we get another season like that, I'll just be entirely chuffed.
Looking at the Apex Sunday ratings for each race across the season, John had an average of 4.5 out of 10. Rob had an average of 4.1 out of 10. But looking back at the season overall, how would we rate the entire season? I've heard people say that the 2021 season was one of the greatest seasons in the history of the sport. I'm going to have to disagree. The use of the word greatest is overdone these days, although I do appreciate and recognize the enthusiasm. And there were some great things about this season. The championship battle, Ocon, Gasly, Fernando, Norris, Sainz. But the lack of racecraft from the champion, the absurd penalties, and the very large gaps between the top teams and the others, I can only give the season a 6. If you want to see an intense, close racing world championship, take a look at MotoGP. I do hope that the new rules for 2022 improve the situation, if not entirely for next season, then the seasons that follow.
Rating the season is a tough thing with this. On a scale of 10, I could rate it an 11 if it wasn't for the officiating and the horrific end to the season. Those two things just throw a big wrench into the whole thing, as well as the way Red Bull dealt with Max, encouraging him to drive like a NASCAR driver. Well, that's a bad thing to say. I realize that there are NASCAR fans out there, but just a little bit of a bully and driving like a maniac, and that's not the top level of motorsport. 7.5. I'll give it a 7.5.
Looking at the Apex Sunday driver ratings for each race, Rob had Norris 6 times as driver of the race. John had Norris and Hamilton 4 times as driver of the race. Of course, this doesn't mean they were automatically the drivers of the season. So who are our overall drivers of the season? For the driver of the season, for me, it's clearly Lewis. The way he fought back in the championship and his racecraft, particularly at Brazil, was incredibly impressive. He has 7 world titles, and he was in contention right to the very end for an 8th. This is proof not only of his talent, but of all the other aspects that a driver needs to be a repeat championship. Of course, all the drivers are more than just their talent, but talent alone seems to be the factor many talk about. For me personally, Marc Marquez in MotoGP is the most impressive racer I've ever seen, but Lewis comes a very close second.
Driver of the season. My God, everybody but Mazepin. And Danny Ricciardo, or Ricciardo, I should say. Those 2 guys, rather disappointing. But the rest of them, unbelievable. There's so many great drivers. I don't know if I can pick a driver of the year. Gasly, my God. Norris, unbelievable. Sainz, hopping in a new car, and look what he did. I have to give it to Lewis. He took it to a new level where he's racing in a very mature way, and he put on a masterclass. Or is it Alonso? No, it's got to be Lewis.
For the 2022 season, we have what I consider to be 4 significant changes. First of all, the changes to the aerodynamics. We're going to have less downforce over the top of the car and a return to ground effects beneath the car to generate downforce. This will supposedly produce less dirty air for the cars following in the aerodynamic wake, and perhaps therefore make for more passing. Now, early reports from the drivers after the first test indicate that it is easier to follow other drivers, so I'm hopeful that this is the case. Conversely, if this is the case, the importance of qualifying and starting well on the grid may be reduced. If the top cars are significantly faster, then they'll find it much easier to move through the field. So, for example, we'll see Bottas moving through the field if he was still in Mercedes. So Fernando holding up Lewis at Hungary or Ocon holding up Lewis at Qatar may no longer be possible. The second is the budget cap. And admittedly, this is a pretty abstract thing for me. It's difficult to even get a real view of what's going on here. But I suppose what it's supposed to mean is that the large teams can no longer vastly outspend the smaller teams. But given how poorly the FIA has governed the racing in the sport, it remains to be seen if they can effectively govern the budget cap. Of course, the people employed at each team are the key, and I wouldn't be surprised if Mercedes, Red Bull, and Ferrari are still the top 3 teams. That said, another team or more could surprise us, and I hope that's the case. The third is the engine freeze. Again, to reduce development costs and most likely to fit under the new budget cap, the engines that the teams have for 2022, as I understand it, are the engines they'll be using through 2025 until the new engine formula comes in. There is supposed to be some sort of allowance for some development if an engine proves to be a disaster, but details are vague at the moment. Now, every engine manufacturer has updated their engine for the 22 season, and that will be the engine they have to use through to 2025. Now, if teams get that significantly wrong, we could have seasons of uncompetitive cars. Fourth is, if you make the top 10 in qualifying, you no longer have to start the race on the tire you qualified on in Q2. Now, this rule favored the fastest teams as they were able to save more of the fastest tires in a weekend. So we'll see how the strategy changes with the revised rule. As for predictions, I'm no Nostradamus. I hope a team or two surprises and we have 4 or 5 top teams instead of 2. But as I said before, I expect the fight to be between Mercedes and Red Bull. I'm looking forward to what Russell can do in a Mercedes, and I hope that Alpine lives up to its work status as well as McLaren. As for the look of the new cars, I think overall they look great. My favorite F1 car in terms of looks is the McLaren MP48. I love the shape and simplicity of that look. Another very popular car in terms of looks is the Jordan B191. Now, Aston Martin's new car reminded me of that car a little bit, and I do love the look of the Alpine's livery. So I'm very glad that we're not going to see those hideous cars we saw in the late 2000s with the X-Wings and so forth. Really happy that the cars look sleek and fast, and can't wait for the next season.
Crystal ball for the upcoming season. Wow, that's a really tough one. You know, I think this is one of those few moments we get in Formula One where we can look at it and say, I have no idea. The beauty of it is who's going to be out front. We have no idea. It could be Renault, Alpine. It could be Haas. Really, it could be Haas. Who knows who it's going to be? If you listen to Button and a few of the other guys, they say it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be Red Bull and it's going to be Mercedes. But I don't buy that. This is a new season with a brand new formula, and we could end up with anything. The one thing I would say is Adrian Newey, and Red Bull have Adrian Newey. If there's one person that can change all that and a feather in the cap, the ace in the hole, it's Adrian Newey, which means Red Bull will likely be out front. They'll be in the top 3 would be my guess, probably the top, but anything can happen. It's exciting. I like this.
I cut out cable from my life about a decade ago. Netflix, F1 TV, the MotoGP Video Pass, and of course YouTube are all I'm currently interested in. In this age of anyone can be a broadcaster, we get a mix of great sources of information and inspiration, and of course, unfortunately, some rather terrible sources of disinformation. We'll try not to be like that. Now, we have some favorite auto racing related YouTube channels we would like to recommend. The links will be in the description and also in the channels tab of the Apex Sunday podcast channel. If you like our content, like, subscribe, and share. We really appreciate it. We'll start with Mark Priestley's F1 Elvis channel. It's run by a former McLaren mechanic, Mark, who worked with Kimi, Lewis, and Fernando. He's also the author of the excellent The Mechanic, The Secret World of the F1 Pit Lane. He offers great insights into the F1 Championship and hosts a live chat after each race. Now, if you like sim racing, and particularly vintage sim racing, check out the superb GP Laps channel. It's a wonderful channel that focuses on vintage championships using vintage games like Grand Prix Legends, Richard Burns Rally, and IndyCar 2, as well as modern games, usually with vintage cars, such as Assetto Corsa, R-Factor 2, and Automobilista 2. Now, for information from reporters that are very close to F1 at the testing and races, check out Autosport's channel The Race, as well as their website. A favorite MotoGP channel of mine is CrashNet's MotoGP channel, hosted by Harry Benjamin, journalist Peter McLaren, and former rider and BT Sport broadcaster Keith Hewen, who, when I first heard his commentary, I thought, oh wow, this is a surprise. Eric Idle is commentating MotoGP. Like Mark Priestley's F1 channel, that channel offers some great insights into the Formula One Championship. This channel offers some great perspectives on the MotoGP Championship. We're also big fans of the Driver 61 channel, hosted by Scott, not related to Nigel Mansell. There's other hosts as well, and some great guests. There are some wonderful features on a variety of F1 and racing-related subjects. We especially like the features of how particular F1 drivers drive. Check out the one on Alonso. The Chain Bear channel is an excellent channel to get in-depth technical insights on a variety of F1 related subjects, from tires, suspensions, and others. You also have the Peter Windsor channel. He's been around F1 for years, and he offers his insight on the Formula One Championship. We highly recommend it. There are other channels as well, such as F1 Visualize, which offers an 8-bit graphic style look at Formula One's numbers. Leave your favorite channel recommendations in the comments below if you like.
There's a lot of great information out there on available today that is so wonderful. There are two that I follow religiously. One is Priestley. His background working with the team in Formula One, of course, gives him a great leg up, and usually provides some insight that I wouldn't normally think of. The other one is Peter Windsor, and Peter Windsor has been around a very long time. I mean, he was with Frank Williams when Frank Williams crashed his road car and became a paraplegic. He too provides some great insight, a little bit opinionated, but I really like his stuff.
The new season is around the corner, and John and I will be reviewing each race and sharing our thoughts with you. If you like this video, please subscribe, like, share, and comment. And we'll look forward to seeing you in 2022. And hopefully it's a great season. Bye-bye.